Okay, well, what I'm going to give you is something that is, in a way, it's a conversation that I have with my wife on the kitchen table about our future and the future of the world. I just want to stipulate one thing in advance. I'm going to be very critical of the United States, and but I want to stipulate that any criticism I make of the United States does not imply the endorsement of the policies of any other state. It's simply because of the importance of the U.S. in the international order. Now, this is very consistent with things a lot of people have said, but I see really a major crisis coming in the international system, and it will come the way a character in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises was asked, how did you become bankrupt? And he said, at first gradually and then suddenly. So that is how it's going to come. The international system since 1945 has been, roughly speaking, this is just an abstraction, but let's say for the sake of discussion, based on three things. One is the hegemony of a U.S. state which advocated and democracy, and which during that period increasingly practiced it at home because of the civil rights movement and so on. Now, that doesn't, I'm not claiming that the U.S. stood for democracy around the world or anything like that, but the fact that the leading country in the world was a democracy, or claimed to be a democracy, or set that as a standard, did affect a lot of the political discourse. I'll just recount you one incident. I was in Beijing once with a friend of mine who's a very senior official of the Chinese Communist Party, and we were driving in a car. This is during Trump, and we were talking about the decline of democracy in the United States during Trump. And I can't say how much this represents anyone else, but he said that, we don't believe China can be a democracy. We don't aspire to be like the United States. But the fact that a country like the United States, with the freedoms and so on that it has, gave us a kind of hope. And that was disappearing. Now, the thing is, that hope is very likely to disappear on a pretty permanent basis within the next 2 to 4 years. Second, the U.S. dollar as the stable reserve currency for the entire world. That had to do, came out of the U.S. domination of the world economy, which is now a thing of the past, or partly a thing of the past, becoming more of a thing of the past. And I will come to how the hegemony of the dollar is being undermined in many ways by the way that the U.S. is using the hegemony of the dollar for its specific political interests. And third, this is, I can't substantiate it, but I think all of us in this room, except maybe there are some very young people here, but we all grew up at a time when it was kind of considered normal to have expectations that the future would be better than the past. After all, what do we call poor countries? We call them developing countries, And I think pretty soon that will not be normal. The expectation is going to be that the future will be worse than the past. And that is largely because of global warming, but not just because of the direct effects, but because of all the effects, including the political ones, that Dr. Nugent pointed out in his opening statement. So let me just say a little bit about those three things. One is, I don't know to what extent you follow this here, but the Republican Party in the United States is undermining our electoral institutions in order to institute a permanent minority rule by a white supremacist party. And it is possible that they are going to succeed. Okay, which means that the world's world's dominant, or one of the two world dominant powers, will be a white supremacist party torn by white supremacist organization, white supremacist state, torn by a very lot of internal conflict. What that will mean for international relations is partly unclear, but it will mean a return to, and perhaps accentuation of, the radical nationalist foreign policy of Trump, and a rejection by the United States of international cooperation on the creation of public goods, including fighting climate change, trade agreements, human rights, arms control, peacemaking, and so on. And it will treat great power competition not as a challenge to be managed, but as a struggle to be won. Now, I'm not saying that all of these things were the opposite of that in the past. Of course they weren't. But I'm saying that this will be a much more pronounced effect, and particularly given that China-U.S. cooperation is the core thing that you need to combat global warming. You absolutely will not get it if this type of regime change takes place in the United States. And we can expect climate change to get much, much worse, partly as a result of its political development. Hegemony of the dollar, well, we see already in the case of Afghanistan next door, that Afghanistan's assets, its central bank's assets, are held in mostly held in dollars by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Afghanistan is not the only country whose central bank assets are largely held in dollars inside the U.S. banking system. The clearance mechanism for many international transactions has to go through the United States. This is why the United States is able to impose unilateral sanctions on Iran, on Afghanistan, and elsewhere by simply using the power of its banking system and of the dollar against those that it designates as its enemies. Now that means, of course, what a hegemon does, as opposed to an empire or a dominant ruler, is a hegemon, according to Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, a hegemon actually does produce some public goods. The hegemon uses control of a certain dominant form of power to legitimate that power by producing some public goods. But however, under Trump or similar to Trump administration, the United States will, and not that it has done this consistently anyway, but will be much less inclined to use its power to produce public goods. And eventually, you have seen how the sanctions on Iran, the additional sanctions on Iran by the Trump administration after it left the JCPOA, led to Europeans and others trying to create an alternative payment mechanism, which they have been unable to actually implement. But I'm sure that as this kind of thing increases, then the effort to create alternative payment mechanisms to go around the supremacy of the dollar, to find other places to keep your state assets, will increase. And I'm not sure that will effectively reassert sovereignty or assert sovereignty. It may cause a lot of chaos, but I think it is inevitable. It's an inevitable reaction to the politicization of the dollar hegemony by the United States. Finally, the expectation of the future. Certainly, we all notice the predominance of young people in the movement against climate change internationally, and they're feeling that we have ruined their future, which is accurate actually. But as Professor Najm said, it's not just the future. Let me say again a few words about Afghanistan. The crisis in Afghanistan is partly caused by climate change, because the lack of food and the spread of starvation in Afghanistan is due, of course, partly because of the freezing of the foreign assets, so it can't import food, partly because of the decades of war which made it food dependent, partly, and all those other things. But it's also due to the fact that there was a drought in Afghanistan this year, which destroyed 40% of the crop. And this drought is a result of some systematic trends. First of all, I'm sure you understand this. Here's how Afghanistan works. It has rain-fed, and it has irrigated agriculture, and then it has nomadism. Rain-fed, the water comes from the sky. Irrigation, you bring the water to the people. Nomads, you bring the livestock to the water by moving with the seasons. Now, where does the water come from? Two places. One is from the rain, which both freezes in the Hindu Kush and makes the glaciers, and also feeds rain-fed agriculture and the streams for irrigation. Now, El Nino, a meteorological phenomenon in the Indian Ocean, has grown in such a way that the moist air of the Indian Ocean is no longer coming up over Afghanistan and creating those kind of rains. And that is one of the reasons that you are getting such a severe drought. And El Nino is a phenomenon caused by climate change. I'm not a meteorologist, I can't explain it very well, but so that's part of it. Second, Afghanistan has already reached 2 degrees. That is, the average temperature in Afghanistan is now 2 degrees centigrade higher than it was in 1950, which means that the glaciers are melting, and they're melting rather rapidly. And the glaciers are the water storage of Afghanistan. So it means they're either getting the rain for rain-fed agriculture, the river for irrigation agriculture, the water for human consumption or for animal consumption. And therefore, it is inevitable that we will see large migrations as we are, I'm already over 10 minutes, as we are starting, we're most likely starting to see now. So I have some ideas about what might be done about this, but I'm not very optimistic that any of them will be implemented. But it is possible that we won't have this is a worst case scenario, perhaps due to my lack of imagination. It's possible that this type of regime change will not take place in the United States, but it is a real possibility. And I think I've just given a little taste, I think, of the impacts that it could have. Thank you.